concerning Legislature establishing the Longitudinal Data Act. And if anybody knows if McNorton and Owsley are just out in the hallway, oh, okay. There we go. I haven't seen McNorton either. I'm going to open the hearing on this, and we're going to have Nick go first, and then we have two proponent oral testimony, quite a few, which I'll read off at the end, written proponent testimony. We have two neutrals from KNEA and KASB, and then one oppositional testimony written only from the PTA. And even in my folder, which on the RS number that folder is empty for me. So I think we sent it all, and we'll get it out to you as far as whether we have to email it or make sure they get it posted. I know Rose sent it to the powers that be to do all the uploading, and because I have printed copies of it, and I watched her do it because she's doing awesome. And so that not being there is not her fault or our fault. It's just we'll get it to you as we go. And with that, I will call up Nick to give us an overview.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, committee. Committee, House Bill 2303, this bill would enact the Longitudinal Data Act, is what this would be called. And this would require the establishment of the Division of Longitudinal Data within the legislative branch. And this division would be responsible for developing and maintaining the Kansas Longitudinal Data System and the Kansas Credential and Skills Registry as part of that system. And then lastly, this would appropriate some money to establish this division within the legislative branch of the state government. So I'll get into kind of what this bill is doing. So first off, committee, new section 2 of the bill defines a lot of the terms that are used throughout the bill. So that'll be a good resource for some of the terminology that's used. But beginning with section 4 of the bill, this is the section that would establish the Division of Longitudinal Data within the Kansas Legislative Research Department. Now, the director of this division would be appointed and receive compensation as set by the Legislative Coordinating Council. And this director would then be authorized to hire additional employees as authorized by the Legislative Coordinating Council. So again, this would be a Legislative Coordinating Council appointment, and then that director would be subject to the Legislative Coordinating Council's oversight. This division, it would be required to, and you can see and follow along on page 4 of the bill, you can see the division's duties. So the division is generally required to establish the Kansas Longitudinal Data System, develop a strategic plan for that system, collect and store data from participating agencies and outside entities that are participating in the system, ensure that the connected data is de-identified, conduct research on the data in accordance with the research agenda that's published by the agency, oversee security and protection of the data, develop a data governance and security plan for the system, and develop strategies to promote transparent operation of the system, and then annually report to the Legislative Coordinating Council about the actions and requirements of the Division of Longitudinal Data. So this division would be required, and the director of the division would be required to create a prioritized list of data research requests as this thing gets moving. So on January 31, 2026, on or before that date, the division would be required to start accepting data research requests from the legislature, the governor, or any executive branch agency, including the State Board of Education and the State Board of Regents. And then additionally, in addition to those agencies that are listed out specifically there, upon the approval of the Legislative Coordinating Council, the division would also be able and be authorized to prepare data research requests upon the request of any state governmental entity, political subdivision thereof, private entity, or a member of the public. And for these data research requests, the division would be authorized to charge those entities any costs that are associated with completing that data research. If there is a data breach, Section 4 of the bill does state that the division would be subject to the requirements of KSA 757244 with regard to data breaches and notifications thereof, and then also any other statutes and laws relating to data breaches. So that was the establishment of the Division of Longitudinal Data, of the division. The division in Section 3 would be required to establish the Kansas Longitudinal Data System, otherwise known as the system. So this system would be required to be developed to store, exchange, de-identify, match, and provide resources for the legislature and state agencies to improve education and workforce outcomes. And so if an agency is defined as a participating agency under the bill, such agency would be required to enter into a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, with the division to participate and provide data to the division for the purpose of use in the system. Participating agency, as defined in the bill, includes the State Department of Education, the State Board of Regents, the Department of Labor, the Department of Revenue, the Department of Health and Environment, and the Department of Commerce. And then the bill and this section does state that any outside entity would also be authorized to participate in the system by also entering into an MOU with the division and submitting data and participating in that manner. So Section 5 of the bill, it would prohibit direct access to data in the system except for, and to authorize staff of the division, any research designee that's hired by the division, and then any other person approved by the LCC who have a need to access the data held within the system. The division pursuant to this bill would also be authorized to limit direct access as may be necessary to the data in the system. So Section 6 of the bill is concerning the designation of a research designee. So this section would authorize the division to hire a research designee to assist with data research. And this would need to be an individual with expertise in data analysis, education, workforce, or related fields. This research designee would also need to be approved by the LCC before that designee can commence research work in the system. And once designated, the research designee would serve for a term of 3 years and would be authorized to assist with data research requests. The bill does provide that the LCC can remove that research designee for cause, if there is some for cause reason to remove that designee. Section 7 of the bill would require the division to establish the Kansas Credential and Skills Registry, and the purpose of this would be to provide up-to-date information on educational and occupational credentials that are essentially granted or funded or governed by the state. And this would include things such as diplomas, certificates, certifications, digital badges, apprenticeships, licenses, and then also degrees of all types. You can see what would be required in that credential registry on page 6 of the bill, and you can see the numbers 1 through I think 16 there of the items that would be required to be included in that credential registry. So this part of this credential registry, the division would be required to develop a list of credentials that are aligned to in-demand occupations for each industry operating in the state. And this registry would be required to be accessible by the public and available to the public. And this registry would not include personally identifiable data about the holder of those credentials. So a couple final things, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Section 8 has a sunset provision, and this would expire the entirety of the Longitudinal Data Act on January 1, 2033, unless the legislature were to reauthorize it. Section 9 does appropriate $3 million from the State General Fund for fiscal year 2026 directly to the Legislative Coordinating Council to provide for the establishment of the division. And then lastly, the Section 10 amends current law. There's some statutes called the Student Data Privacy Act that we have in our education statutes, and it limits what education data can be shared and who that education data can be shared with. So this amends that Student Data Privacy Act to expressly authorize the disclosure of student data to the Division of Longitudinal Data. And if this bill's enacted, I think it would take effect. Let me check real fast. I don't have that in my memo. Yes, publication in the statute book, so this would take effect on July 1, 2025. And Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
All right, committee, overarching or technical questions for Nick. Representative McDonald.
I'm going to ask for your patience in advance because I have a lot of them. How would this bill impact or change the Student Data Privacy Act?
So this would specifically authorize disclosure of student data to the division.
Okay.
Under that act. So it's amending that act to say that student data may be shared with the division.
And there's no way for parents to opt out of that?
No, I don't.
I didn't see any language to account for that.
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Would the $3 million, can I ask more than one question? Sorry.
Yeah, let's go with maybe two more, just to give everybody a chance, and then we'll come back to you if there isn't any more.
Okay. Would the $3 million come from the state general fund?
Yes, correct.
Okay, and I didn't see a fiscal note, so I'm assuming that would be it. And then I had a really curious question. On page 7, line 42, it mentions official hospitality. I don't know what that means. It's next to the $3 million amount. I asked some people in the audience and they didn't know either.
Yeah, that's a good question. That is some language that we use with line items in budget bills. I don't know that it has, I don't know the true meaning of it, so I don't know if it's truly necessary, but official hospitality is travel expenses and expenses related to travel like that.
Well, there was some language, maybe it was referring to the same travel expenses as the legislature, and that part I know was pretty clear, but yeah, maybe follow up with some clarity around the other one, just making sure that is what is the tie-in there. Other questions? Representative Steele?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you say student data, I could be wrong, Representative that spoke just a minute ago, but I'm curious if maybe a little more specific on what does student data mean might clear the air potentially. Thank you.
I love it when he does this, when he goes to the real book.
So in the Student Data Privacy Act, we do define student data. And it is, I mean, it's assessment results, courses taken and completed, credits, grades, grade point average, date of birth, grade level, expected date of graduation, degrees, diplomas, credentials attained, attendance and mobility, data required for cohort graduation rate, remediation, special education data, demographic data, and any other information included in the student's educational record. So basically, it's the data in the kid's data system.
Other questions for Nick? Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this information. I do have one question, though. Will there be an identifier there of a student name? We have the data, but can you track that down to a student name?
Well, if the data sharing that occurs is sharing the kid's data system data with this agency, they would, I assume, have the student identifier. Now, how they're presenting the data on the other end, I believe they'd be de-aggregating the data and presenting disaggregated data.
Mr. Chair, can I? So if on the other side, the researcher, would they have restrictions on how they can utilize a student's name?
So the bill does state that the division has authority to limit access to data, and I assume within that kind of authority that the division would have would be the authority to also limit how the data shall be used, disseminated, or protected.
Representative Poskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is about privacy as well. In section 5, it sounds like it would allow the LCC to grant direct access to the data, which I expect would include the data with student names and so forth, to whomever they would want. And I ask that because of my constituents' current concern about the Social Security records, their veterans records, their student loan records and all that being accessed by Elon Musk. And I'm wondering, does this section provide the same thing, that LCC could just give that access to the direct data to whomever they choose?
So yes, Representative Poskin, new section 5 does, first it states that the access shall be limited to authorized staff within the division, but then it does have that line that you're pointing to, that it couldn't be accessed by the research designee or other persons approved by the LCC if such persons have a need to access such data to further the objectives of this act. So that would be the qualifier language right there. So the LCC could grant it if that person has a need to access the data to further the objectives of the act.
And, so it would be the LCC determining if they have the need?
Essentially, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Brantley.
So I'm processing, thank you, Mr. Chair. So if I'm accessing the data, I have a purpose for utilizing the specific results, correct? In a report or something that would not have the student's name in that piece, correct?
I think through that route, like I think the bill is structured in a way that most folks who want some data or a research would be submitting a data research request to this division. They wouldn't be seeking approval to be within the whole entire system. I think they would go under that research request designation and request that research be done and that the division handle that request based on what the timeline that they have and what they can or cannot do.
Thank you. And just to clarify, if that was deemed misused, they could be removed from the system?
Yes, I assume so. I assume there could be some action taken there.
Representative Poskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just double checking that on the credential and skill registry, that is a forward-facing public like dashboard, giving the information that they would need to, you know, perhaps make policy decisions and so forth. But that is the part that's forward-facing and accessible to the people who will be using this longitudinal data. Right.
Yes, thank you. Yes, new section 7, dealing with that credential and skills registry portion, that subsection D does state that that registry shall be available to the public, but the primary system that is getting the data from participating agencies, that would not necessarily be a public-facing system. Again, that research requests would come in, research would be conducted on that data, and then what's produced would be disaggregated, de-identified data.
Okay. So basically, the other information is upon request. Like if you needed to know something that wasn't in the credential and skills registry, you would make a data request or a report request to the division?
That's my understanding. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And that would still be void of names, but it would be maybe a further request. Say, I don't want to know how many credentials we have in certain CTE program, but they would never come back in a way where you could link a certain student with a certain credential.
Yes, and I mean, that is subsection D of that credential registry, Mr. Chairman, does state that it should not or shall not include any personally identifiable information, any PII. That doesn't, or would let you identify the holders of those credentials. So the PII shall be removed from that, or so that you can't track one person down.
Thank you for that. Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry. Too many committees today. Nick, just to be clear on this, this data central, if we want to call it that, doesn't have any authority to collect any new data that agencies aren't already collecting. Is that correct?
Well, this bill, I think, is only drafted in the sense that they would be receiving, I think I'm on the same page with you. This division would be receiving this data from these agencies. It wouldn't necessarily be collecting its own sets of data. It would be entering into MOUs with these agencies and other participating outside entities to receive the data and then conduct research on that data.
So it's really about accessibility and centrality, not a whole nother level of data collection that is going to be accessing records that weren't previously accessed.
I might leave that one, that's kind of getting more to the intent behind this. I might leave that one to most likely the proponents of the legislation, and just kind of leave it there and let them talk about kind of the purpose of this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got some concerns about the qualifications of a research designee, but I think my question would be the appropriation for $3 million, does that include any FTEs? Or is this, if we're establishing a new division, if I'm tracking, there's a possibility I'm not. But if I'm tracking, what are the FTEs of the new division?
So that's a good question. My belief is that that $3 million appropriation is contemplating the establishment of the system, the payment for the director, and then also to hire employees. So I believe there would be some employees that would be hired through this $3 million appropriation. Now, discussions on how many FTEs and stuff like that would have to come maybe through this committee or through appropriations or something like that committee if this appropriation ends up wrapped into the larger budget bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And we'll have time, and if as we go, we have more questions for Nick, I think we can engage him, but we'll do, I would like to move on just to give plenty of space. There's a PowerPoint presentation from the Aligned Group who is bringing some of this proposal to the forefront, and so maybe more of our questions could be geared towards them. So I would invite Eric to come up, and we'll make sure that we have your PowerPoint going, and please introduce yourself and.
And thank you, Nick. Kansas and Missouri. We bring together business community members to influence education policy to better align it, hence the name, with workforce outcomes in the state of Kansas and Missouri. And today I'm here in rise in support of HB 2303, the Longitudinal Data Act. Ultimately, we have to look at our current data approaches to understand where they're deficient so that we can understand then what state longitudinal data systems can help you all out with here within the legislature, as well as the other applicability of these longitudinal data systems. Right now, I would characterize the Kansas data system as fragmented, siloed, and providing you a snapshot in time. So you are requesting data from the various departments we heard Nick mention today that provides you with information of students as they are in this current time. What statewide longitudinal data systems do is to attach all of those data systems together across sectors and also across time to give you a more holistic view of a student as they matriculate through the system. Increasingly, we also see the research community outside of Kansas really coalesce around these kind of indicators around academic, student well-being, and career readiness to really evaluate not only the systems, but also the classrooms, the institutions, the instructors that are providing education within states and institutions to really understand what is an actual hallmark of a good system, a good institution, a good classroom, a good teacher. And, you know, organizations like Mathematica, for instance, have put together, and I'm going to show you on this next slide, a holistic understanding of these indicators that range, like I said, from outcomes and milestones associated with individual students, but also indicators that are associated with the specific systems and institutions we're talking to here. I understand this is a lot. You will all have a copy of this, but it's really fascinating stuff. So now we have to ask ourselves, where do statewide longitudinal systems kind of step into the breach? We have all these indicators we understand that are kind of hallmarks of a good education system. And we've seen that over the past 15 years, especially, states invest in statewide longitudinal data systems to understand these hallmarks and track them over time as students go through the pre-K system, whatever form that may take, and enter the K-12 system, ultimately matriculating to a post-secondary education, what form that may take, and then what kind of jobs, how much money are they making, and really linking that together over across time and the sectors that we're talking about here today. So in total, currently 42 states across the United States either have or are currently developing a state longitudinal data system according to Education Commission of the states. Some key features of state longitudinal data systems is one, we're talking about high quality data, student and instructor data, data that's already being collected, like Nick mentioned, by the various agencies that we're touching on here today. The other thing is that it's over time. That's that longitudinal aspect. We're not asking for a student who has a third grade reading level in 2020. We're asking that student who has a third grade reading level in 2020 as they matriculate, how are they doing? We're asking things over time. And then finally, that there is a utilization component, that you as legislators, as policymakers, as those who are system practitioners, those within the executive agencies, are actually interacting with the data, are requesting the data, and using it to inform their decision-making processes. The purpose, to get to Nick, what he was talking about earlier, behind longitudinal data systems we've seen in many states, is to ultimately empower decision-making at all levels, to break down the barriers of the various bureaucratic silos of data collection that we have talked about today, and to optimize resource allocation we've seen in states. Ultimately, all of this is done to enhance student success. In addition, we want to help transform education practices across the systems. We're not just focused on K-12, we're not just focused on higher ed, we're focused on a student's holistic journey throughout the education system. And we're also helping grant decision makers like yourselves deeper, richer insights than what you're getting from the agencies currently. Ultimately, this is coming together to build what we've seen in states as a culture of innovation and decision making. It's allowing you all to get access to information that you may not be able to get access yourself currently, or the insights that may be applicable to the research that can be done by the said division that could not be done currently. So one of the key points of a state longitudinal data system, like I said, is the utilization piece. And as you can see, this map here indicates the various reasons and ways that states right now use longitudinal data systems on the state policy making level. So we primarily see this through publishing reports that the legislature requests on an annual or a semi-annual basis, and accessible dashboards like Nick talked about with the Public Skills and Credentials Registry, and as well as answer these specific questions that you all have that are not necessarily related to an annual or a semi-annual report or a dashboard that the office would be responsible for. So to really kind of give you a contextual understanding of what this looks like, I wanted to provide some state examples. You can peruse this at your leisure, and the examples contain links linking to each state longitudinal data system that I have here, but I wanted to call out a few. For instance, Arkansas right now is analyzing its early childhood and care education system in the state using state longitudinal data systems, understanding the mixed delivery methods that are available in the state and how those relate to educational and eventually workforce outcomes over time. Nebraska is doing an interesting thing as it relates to talent retention. They, like the state of Kansas, are facing a flood of students who are leaving Kansas for other occupations and opportunities outside the state of Kansas, and so they're trying to understand what types of students they are, where they're actually going, what are the workforce outcomes associated with those students, and how can we maybe meet those needs in Nebraska. And then finally, Utah, which is a very interesting case study that answers specific questions from legislators. And I wanted to highlight one in particular, which is they're trying to understand the relationship between certain courses that high schoolers take, for instance, and their effects on their college readiness. So what are we actually seeing in terms of the type of courses that high school students are taking and whether or not when they enter post-secondary education in the state of Utah, they are deemed college ready. One notable example is also the oldest state longitudinal data system is Kentucky. They are notable because they've established their own independent office, and like the one being proposed here today, it started as just a creature of K-12 education and workforce, but it has now grown to other areas of public policy, stretching from welfare to transportation, and it is as seen by members of the Kentucky legislature as an incredibly useful tool. The report I have linked on the screen is notable. It's the Future Skills Report. They do this on an annual basis. This is their analysis of current workforce trends within the state of Kentucky, and it also allows them to project future needs going forward. So we talked about what a lot of other states are doing with state longitudinal data systems, and I hope you have a better idea. I'm happy to take questions after this about them, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about what HB 2303 does, if we have time, Chairman. Okay. First, I want you to think about it in terms of establishing the governance of the system. So, like Nick talked about earlier, it's a division of longitudinal data that's located under the Department of Legislative Research. It is governed by the Legislative Coordinating Council, just like the Legislative Research Department is, which will oversee the operations of said system and set the research priorities. Ultimately, this division is responsible for collaborating with agencies to input the data into the system. The bill also outlines the core functions of the system. It is to the initial process, which is integrating and de-identifying that data, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a second. The second core function is that research request process. So ultimately, you all as legislators, as well as those within the executive branch, will be able to request certain data of the system, and they will be able to provide you an outcome or an answer using aggregate level student data. One more of the core functions I should highlight is the dashboard, the Public Skills and Credentials Registry. I want you to really all think about that as the first deliverable of the longitudinal data system. It is the first way in which you all can see how you can provide forward-facing online dashboards that are accessible to members of the public, not just to yourselves, that align with the overall intent of the bill, which is aligning education and workforce pathways to provide opportunities for students to get high-wage, high-in-demand jobs here in Kansas and stay in Kansas. So I wanted to briefly mention before I close and take some questions, just the data privacy and security piece. So the way we've seen states implement these systems is the relevant agencies upload their data, they enter MOUs with the relevant entity that is responsible, in this case the division, for hosting that data. The division then will de-identify that data by assigning unique student identifiers to then match the data across the various sectors that we're talking about. That's really the hard part, is matching the data from when a student enters the early childhood education space to the K-12 space, matching it with Board of Regents, and then Workforce, Commerce, and Department of Labor and Revenue. That is really the hard part of the initial phase phase of implementation. Then afterwards, that data will be using that unique student identifier and will be anonymized, meaning that we cannot go back and figure out who that student was with that unique student identifier. Only the people who control the firewall, the people within the division would be able to do so. But ultimately, the data that you would be getting through research requests would be aggregated level data, not student level data. The fiscal note, like Nick mentioned, is $3 million annually. The intent of that is, to your question, Representative, foresees either contracting out the services with vendor as the bill provides to help set up the initial operations or to operationalize the system as it continues, or the ability to hire in-house FTEs to be researchers, data scientists, or statisticians to actually carry out the core functions of the system. Just for reference, other states with a system of using a $3 million annual appropriation of this size have between anywhere from 6 to 10 FTEs in total within an office like that. So that is what we're talking about here. And like Nick said, the entire system, if it does not prove its value to you all in the legislature, will sunset after 5 years. That is all I have for you today. Please, I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Representative Brantley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So essentially what you are saying is that name recognition, that you have those protections in place so that it can't be narrowed down to a student name.
That's correct.
And then one other question, Mr. Chair, if I may. So if my district has signed an MOU, we've uploaded their data, can you build a report for my district based on any specific data that I'd want?
So a point of clarification, your district, assuming it's a public school district, is already uploading data to the Department of Education. So we'd be able to access that data already. So your individual district would not have to sign an MOU, for instance, with the division. That data already exists within the department, so that data would be shared automatically. However, there are other types of schools and schooling systems outside of the data collection that is being held by the Department of Education that could independently sign an MOU. I'm sorry, I forgot your second part of your question.
You're good. Well, then, once my district is involved, can you build a report so we don't have to keep inputting data each time and streamline our process and make it easier for us as a district?
To be frank, that's not what the system is intended to do. It's not intended to be a report function for you. It's intended to be an analysis function for a broader audience. And also, it would have to do with the scale. Privacy laws on the state and federal level prohibit certain smaller school districts from being necessarily identified because it's really easy to identify 3 random kids versus 150 random kids in school A versus school B, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
I saw Representative Schmoy first, then we'll come over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Who all has access to this data, and is the legislature the target audience, or do you have a broader target audience of who will be using this data?
The primary access of this data will be the division. They will be the ones who are actually collating and collecting the data, de-identifying it, and then doing research analysis on it. The primary audience is absolutely legislators and policymakers, but to a lesser extent also system leaders, institution leaders outside of the legislature who create and affect policy decisions. Secondarily, we've seen state longitudinal data systems be incredibly handy for prospective students figuring out what their post-secondary careers could look like, for families navigating a very complicated system, what that student could be going through, as well as educators. They get a lot of insight into this. For instance, those who are coming from the K-12 system into the Board of Regents system, those Board of Regents systems can then better understand and meet the needs of the students who are coming in, and they have been clamoring for the data.
Representative Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. May I ask a couple? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Eric, for your presentation. It was wonderful. I would like to make a comparison maybe. In the healthcare field, this is already being done because your medical records are already longitudinally being shared. So your medical records are essentially being shared. So I'm just trying to make a comparison that what we're doing here with longitudinal data in education and career is already being done in the healthcare field. Is that correct?
To my understanding, yes.
Okay, thank you. And you talked a lot about education, which is fantastic. Can you tell me, because the second part of the bill is really dealing with careers, and so how are people like economic development, people in our counties able to utilize this data?
Yeah, I think they can, that's kind of where the exciting bit comes in, is they can start to understand, okay, what kind of students in labor force that are existing right now in Kansas? Like, what are the unmet needs within specific regions in Kansas? And what are the actual projected needs for specific regions in Kansas going forward? So that can be an exciting tool for private entities, businesses, to really understand and how they make decisions and then make decisions based on that data. Absent that data, they're kind of making decisions, you know, based on other data inputs, but this is kind of another tool in their toolbox to make decisions.
And it would be, I guess I'm just, when we're collecting data from all these different agencies, they're actually potentially going to be able to make better decisions because it's all being coordinated, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, one more, Mr. Chair. $3 million, what are other states doing?
In terms of the fiscal cost?
Yes, sir.
You know, it really ranges. 3 million is the low end because we wanted to start out small and work. It can range between 2.8 and, you know, up to $10 million based on what we're asking the system to do. It's fundamentally based on the questions you're asking. So if you're interested not just in education, workforce outcomes, but other things like healthcare outcomes, for instance, or tracking the opioid crisis, or understanding your water infrastructure. Obviously, that's outside the remits of this committee, but that is what other states are asking longitudinal data systems to look at. Those data systems, those separate, distinct bureaucracies that control those data systems over time.
And my last question, the bill specifically lists specific organizations. And so, help the freshman out, it might be a nit question, because if this goes through, these agencies would then be required to ensure that all data they currently collect or potentially will collect in the future due to new statute would be shared with this.
That is correct. The bill would require these participating agencies that you see listed on page 2 of the bill to enter into an MOU data sharing agreement with the division.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Eric, for a presentation. I would say that the only thing more significant than the accurate use of good data is the inaccurate use of bad data. As you have worked in a number of states and a number of different data systems, how do you deal with the issue that data is not necessarily consistent over time? For example, would be that assessment tests are changed, so the value that come from those vary. Additionally, when we're looking at longitudinal data, sometimes we assume that we're looking at the same individuals when we're not in longitudinal studies. How do you assure the accuracy, the reliability, the consistency of data over time?
I think that's a great question. It ultimately will be sussed out in the implementation phase because those insights are key. The Kansas assessment regime has changed notably over the past 10, 15 years, and it will continue, I assume, to change. Notable other systems that we're talking about here are not stagnant. We're not talking about things that are staying in time. To ensure that is actually accounted for in the systems, we've seen states really work closely, and that's where that collaborative aspect comes in, where the agencies really relate to the system who is controlling the system to understand that maybe it's not an apples and apples comparison to look at these various things. And that's really where you can have that kind of deeper insight when you're asking data research request questions as to what is the relationship between these two things, and maybe that context is key to maybe not establish a relationship between those things. But I think ultimately it's really the agencies coming together as a governing entity, in this case the LCC, to ensure that we're asking reasonable and practicable questions, and that it can actually output things that are reasonable to ascertain statistical insignificance from.
Do you anticipate that there will be qualified statisticians within this department, or are these just data collection people?
Definitely not just data collection people. In other states, we can see titles such as data analysts, data scientists, statisticians. So yes, we absolutely foresee Kansas being able to attract those types of positions.
Thank you very much.
Representative McDonald was next, and then we'll come over to you.
I have more than one, so you can stop me when you want to. I assume you're familiar with the Kansas Department of Education's longitudinal data system. I think we've spent somewhere between 7 and 12 million on that so far. Frank can correct me. How does your bill fit with the work that KSDE is already doing with that?
So my understanding is that the Department of Education has received various federal grants to establish a longitudinal data system over the years, most recently, I think, in 2018 or 2019. Frank, correct me if I'm wrong. Ultimately, that data system has, we've been told and informed, been sitting behind the firewall, unable to be analyzed by the department, which is ultimately where this bill kind of fits in. Ultimately, that type of data gives us clearinghouse data access to not only what's going on now, but going back 10 years to 2008, so that that data would be integrated within this, so that we could start to analyze it as well.
I'm not sure, I haven't asked Frank if they are not able to analyze that data, or if that's because we take money from the Department of Ed so they don't have the personnel to manage that or to analyze that data. So I don't know about that one, but I had a real technical question. On page 4, line 17 of the bill, what are some examples of data that might be collected from outside entities? That's a kind of a vague question. And then would taxpayer dollars be spent on that data procurement? My husband's a data scientist, and I know how expensive buying data from outside entities could become. So page 4, line 17.
So outside entities is a broad definition that can include other participating agencies that are not named. So for instance, other departments within the Kansas government could be a participating agency, but since they are not named as a participating agency, they are named as an outside entity.
So it wouldn't be like asking Google to buy some information or a company outside of government.
It could be. It does include public and private entities as written that enter into the memorandum of understanding, but that is not necessarily what states are utilizing this for. They're utilizing it to cross other agencies within government.
So there would be nothing to prevent this division, I guess is what we're calling it, from spending taxpayer dollars to procure data from outside government agencies?
There would be. The LCC would be the one who is governing those decisions and ultimately deciding that.
I guess my curiosity, I don't really understand the budget or at what point LCC is looped in, how much authority this person heading it up has. I had a couple questions for you as far as would the director of Kansas Legislative Research Department hold any authority at all over these people? Because they're going to be housed in her locale.
From my understanding, that would be a future decision by LCC of how that authority plays out. And that's why we're having a conversation right now to bring these things up, see what solutions we can come to and help them come to other ones down the way. I'm going to interject for a second because a lot of this, and I appreciate the committee's, diligence on managing risk is really what we're talking about here. We've got sensitive data that is out there. They're of my child, my family, your children, your families. And I think all of the same protective measures are still in place, is my understanding. Now, you are including another agency, but that agency is the same as other agencies. They have to obey those same rules. And so I appreciate the questions. They're good questions. The question I wanted to ask, and I'll give Representative McNorton a shot here too. We've got, part of our job is to manage that risk and safeguard, but also to make change. We've got, over the last 2 years, the main thing every time I walked into a meeting, and I'd go back and talk to constituents about this, we have a workforce issue. Almost in every area, in this committee, teachers. I mean, there is workforce issues all over our state, and not to use an old phrase, but to continue doing things the same way and expecting different results borders on insanity. And so this is an idea to bring forth that other states are having some success. And I wondered if you could, my question is, all the risk questions, I'm glad everybody covered them because they're real. The risk to reward factor or the return on investment, what are some of the other states, be it Kentucky, be it whichever other ones, maybe similar to ours, even in the Nebraska space, what has been some of the return for making some of those decisions that have actually shown change? Because I think that's the two sides of this, that why I wanted to have this conversation of how do we enact change in some areas that we've been stagnant in the state, and could this help us?
Yeah. So I think it's a great question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's really key to look at, I think, specific areas of education policy and kind of just broaden out from there. My background is primarily in school finance, so relevant to this committee. The state of Tennessee just recently enacted a state longitudinal data system. They had that system enacted and implemented before. They just recently completely overhauled and rechanged their funding formula. They used to have a resource-based allocation formula. They now have a student-based foundation formula similar to that in Kansas. What that means for them is they will be able to see over time the deficiencies within their formula, to understand how resources are affecting programs, how those programs are relating to student outcomes within specific institutions, and then over time, what that means for those students in this state. We've seen other states use this as an accountability measure within finance. So the state of Texas, for instance, just recently enacted a new community college 2-year funding formula. That funding formula uses credits of value as a measure that they provide supplemental and also operational support to community colleges in Texas by analyzing how many actual of your graduates are graduating in the state of Texas and getting a quote-unquote credential of value. What does that mean? A credential of value is one that they define as a state that can that is a degree, diploma, licensure that can be paid off if the student had to go into debt for it within 7 to 10 years, and that they're making an above median wage in the state of Texas. So they're basing funding decisions based on the data that they're implementing into the longitudinal data system. And ultimately, they're having conversations at the early childhood level in states, like I mentioned in Arkansas. Early childhood education, especially pre-K education, is fundamentally a mixed delivery system in all 50 states of this union. And understanding the various funding streams available for states, understanding the various outcomes available with those different institutions that are providing early childhood education and care in the states, as they matriculate through, we can start to see whether or not you went to a center-based care, whether or not you're receiving reading interventions by the time you're in 4th grade, what is your numeracy score in 8th grade, and whether or not you're graduating high school and going into a high-wage job after you hopefully graduate from a college in that state. That is the type of things that we're asking these systems to do. And it's really fundamentally about the questions that you all have within the legislature, the things that you want to specifically look at, the things that you're interested in reforming at. You can start to get better insights into those things.
Thank you for that. Representative McNorton, you good? Follow up. I'll do one more because then I want to give some space for Mr. Wilk to give his testimony and some questions for him, and then we'll finish it off with any more questions that we have for Eric. So one more, and then we'll go to Mr. Wilk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad you mentioned early childhood because that was one of my questions. What's your plan to gather preschool data? I think that's a challenge for us all. So what are your thoughts on methodology for that?
In terms of gathering data?
I mean, we talk a lot in all these presentations about how we're going to follow them from early childhood to beyond, college. So if we are starting now to try to track kids in preschool, and I don't know that track's the right word, but what are some methods that have worked in other states? Because there are different mixed delivery options.
Yeah, so that's kind of where that allowing other entities to enter into the memorandum of understanding comes into place. We've seen in other states, specifically in Arkansas, we're seeing here that, private entities that are providing early childhood education and care that are acting or opting into the system to share data so that they can ultimately share how well their students are doing, or and on the flip side, maybe not how great they're doing. But ultimately, as the bill is currently written, it is an opt-in system for those things, because we're dealing with private entities, not a public system like K-12 education.
Okay, thank you all for your questions. Hang around.
Yeah, I'll be
And
here.
we'll let Mr. Wilk come up with the chamber, Kansas Chamber. Appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. My name is William Wilkes, Senior Director of Government Affairs for the Kansas Chamber. The Kansas Chamber represents small, medium, and large-sized businesses across the state advocating for policies to improve the economic climate in Kansas. The Kansas Chamber appreciates the opportunity to provide proponent testimony on House Bill 2303 to establish a statewide longitudinal data system. The Kansas Chamber has been working over the past year to implement this data system. I would like to note that it was a recommendation from the 2018 Governor's Workforce Council, along with we did a challenge to compete workforce study back in 2020. Come to find out that was a bad year to conduct a workforce study. A statewide longitudinal data system was also a recommendation in that study as well. So this data, it'll be used to compile current data showing the future workforce trends in our state. The data can be accessed to public, private, nonprofit sector organizations to show those current workforce trends. The data will also be available for parents and educators, obviously, to better prepare the future of the workforce. And the legislature will also have access to this data, providing you all with more accurate information for the future policy decisions of our state. I think it is important to note that we live in an age of innovation and technology. Data is the future of our world, and it is important that we have access to resourceful data when it comes to the future decisions of our state. Currently 33 states have a fully operational statewide longitudinal data system. 9 are in the construction phase, so by this time next year, 42 states will have a fully operational longitudinal data system. Kansas, unfortunately, being one of those 8 states if we were not to pass House Bill 2303. As the chairman was saying previously, access to workers continue to be a top concern for the business community, and ensuring that Kansas remains economically competitive to current and future employers in our state requires data-driven strategies to align educational and training opportunities. Businesses will be able to use this data to identify skills gaps, refining their hiring strategies, and collaborating with the education system to provide those necessary changes for the future of the workforce. In my testimony, I did attach a link to a little 5-minute video that gives a good explanation of what a statewide longitudinal data system is and what it can be used for. But in closing, the Kansas Chamber, we believe that this implementation of a statewide longitudinal data system can lead to education and workforce success in Kansas. And I thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wilk. Any questions? If not, one thing I wonder if you guys have had conversations. If this got propped up, how do you? What is a big win? I mean, you guys have been working on this for the last year, trying to move this forward. Obviously, you think it would help the businesses that you represent. What are some tangible ways you think it's going to help the businesses that you represent? What feedback have you had from them?
I think ultimately just businesses being able to show the data of the future of the workforce and to work with the education system so that the businesses can work hand in hand with them saying this is what we need for the future. We don't have access to this now. I mean, workforce is the #1 issue that I hear from our members of the issues that I cover constantly. And as you were saying previously, we just need different tools in the toolbox to figure out how we fix the problem.
I appreciate that. One thing, and I was just wanted to make a statement. I think I don't want our school system to feel like this is in any way from me or this committee a vote against their current data work. I think they're doing a lot, and a lot of times we are asking a lot of reports. And we just went over that yesterday. I didn't mean to align, no pun intended, the whole idea of going over the reports this week that we are already asking for, and then another possible solution for some of those still coming from there straight to the legislature, some of those being aggregated right into this central data hub to where that is a cooperation point, especially if it's under LCC, which is us through representation. And anyway, it is not a vote against in my mindset. And I'd like to try and share my intent on why we're talking about things or why we're moving in a direction. So my intent is this be an aid. Now, how does it need to get amended so it is fully an aid? How does it need to move in that right direction? What is the right starting point for dollars? All those things, that's why we have great discussion in here. So just want to make that clear for those listening. And any other questions? Representative McNorton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to make sure I'm understanding this right, William, your members come to you and say, we need more computer programmers. So you can look in the data and say that there's none coming out of the pipeline, and the schools are going to go back and change, or how's that going to change that number? How's, just because we're short data or computer programmers, what's that going to do for us to make that get fulfilled?
I think the businesses showing it to the schools that these are going to be high demand, high wage jobs, and showing that schools need to start developing programs for students to be engaged in this, and then that could lead to more computer programmers that.
And how long would that take? You know how things work around here or around government and, general, is high school curriculum going to be able to change quick enough to make a difference?
That I couldn't speak to that. I'd have to gather more input to see how other states do it when a problem arises like that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate you being here today. I've been meaning to try to seek you out to ask a question. I'm on the Literacy Advisory Committee with a couple other people here, and we invested $10 million last year towards literacy initiatives that will fix the problem in the next few years. And this, someone told me, you think it's hard to be a legislator when there's no money. Wait until there is money. It's harder because everyone comes to you asking for it. So does the Kansas Chamber have a position on literacy, funding the blueprint for literacy? Because I think it was stripped out of the budget last I heard. And to me, that is like the biggest workforce initiative we could have, is teaching our kids to read.
Specifically on the blueprint to literacy funding, I don't think we have any specific initiative.
Well, and I would like us to kind of stick on the bill. I know in a roundabout way, that might be an off-mic question first before we bring it onto this bill, just in fairness of germaneness. It's kind of a different issue. Any other questions? And I don't do that very often. That was just a little bit off of our topic. Representative Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My data nerd brain is loving this, but I just want to ensure that from other states, so this might be between the two of you, did we encompass a wide range of departments here to really get the data that we need? Or are we sure we're covered there?
To my understanding, yeah, I believe so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We'll go to Representative Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question is for Nick, the appropriation question. For us to spend money with a private vendor, it would have to be appropriated, and then it would also have to go through an RFP if it was above a certain amount?
Yes, that's correct. There is some RFP requirements in statute, and I assume that this would go through that RFP process. Now, the appropriation in the bill might take care of the money for the first fiscal year for that RFP or the use of it, but certainly it need to be considered thereafter.
So just to confirm, if for money to go to someone private, we would have to agree to that and appropriate it specifically for that purpose. And then if that money was a large amount, it would need to go through an RFP.
I can pull up the competitive bid statute and make sure, but I don't know that you would have to appropriate money specific to the RFP purpose, but certainly I believe if you're going to undertake a project of a certain dollar threshold, it would need to go out for competitive bid and be bid that way.
Thank you.
Representative Owsley, sorry. His head
Thank you,
was in
Mr.
the way.
Chair. And Nick, just along those notes, could you let us know if this 3 million meets that threshold or not? Just as quick as you can. Thank you.
Well, I think the threshold would be what you're looking for in the RFP contract, not necessarily the appropriation to an agency. I'll pull the statute and I'll get some clarity on it. Thank you.
Representative McNorton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So something we haven't discussed, at least I know I was a little late and I apologize, but so can the Department of Education produce this same type of information, reports, or do we need to go to an outside firm to do this? I don't know who that would be towards, or who to ask.
We might open this back up to Eric if you want to comment, and even Dr. Harwood if he would like to. Go ahead.
Can you repeat your question, sir? I'm sorry.
So my question is, can the Department of Education take their siloed, or all the siloed information we have and do this in-house? Or is that not doable? We need to hire you or somebody else from the outside to do that?
Just to be clear, we are not vendors, but theoretically, yes. Other states we've seen have located this within the various executive agencies. So for instance, Kentucky, the KY Stats Office is its own executive branch agency that enters into MOU agreements with it. Other states have enabled their Department of Education to do this. However, what we've seen in those states is they make specific appropriations in and around the same amount of money because we're adding an additional layer. It's not just a reporting requirement to you as the legislature, but you're also adding an analysis component that may not necessarily fall within their current remit or their current FTEs could maybe satisfy.
So you said that, so explain to me what you're doing in this process. If you're not going to be the person, the company collecting all this data and dispersing it, what's your role?
Our role is that Aligned is a business leader-led organization that wants to influence public policy in Kansas and Missouri to align workforce and education outcomes ultimately. So we are here in support of this idea because this is what members of our own boards have told us that they want access to more data to understand it, to make their decisions more aligned with it, to help the education system in Kansas meet some of their workforce needs. Ultimately here, we're just here for the bill, not to benefit from it.
You're just advocating for it.
That's correct.
You're not getting any of the 3 million.
Nope.
Okay, thank you. I didn't realize that, so thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, Eric is not going to be down doing data analysis. It is a good clarifying point because it can be confusing on what this is, but the RFP process, which Nick will get us a little bit more clarity on, that's what this is going for, but the idea of the bill coming forward, and if it, is favorable, then it would move that process forward. Were you nudging me that you wanted to say something, Nick? Go ahead. I'll let you.
Committee members, the statute is for competitive bid requirements is 75, 37, 39, and then there's some other statutes as well. But basically, all contracts for supplies, materials, equipment, and contractual services to be acquired for state agencies shall be based on competitive bids. And then there are some specific requirements. If the amounts is going to exceed $50,000 for that service or the contract, it has to be published in the Kansas Register. And then there's kind of some smaller amounts of how that competitive bid process works.
Give Dr. Harwood a moment to respond to. I think part of the question was just the longitudinal data that you're doing already. I guess my thing, it's really not your job to communicate that with commerce and the regions all the time and be the hub, but make your comments. That's just my thought on where this takes a little bit away and maybe what you feel like you need to keep.
So, so some of what they're talking about is data that we have collected from other agencies as part of looking at our 5-year student success average. We have relationships with some organizations, some already. So to answer your question, the statewide longitudinal data system that we are implementing, so will be in place next year, could have that data in it and connected to it. We didn't build it that way because we were building it for the Department of Education, not for the whole state. So when Eric talks about that other states have said, okay, here's more resources to build this out, to do extra things, that would be the case. So through the process, it could be say, well, what we want to do is, as opposed to going out for an RFP for a third-party vendor to house data, the system that we have could do that, even if legislative research is doing the research portions of it. We could, at that point, give them access to our system with de-identified data. At some point, somebody has to have the identity of everybody in order to match data together. I mean, so we do that currently. We're working with DCF and KDHE trying to do preschool things. We have actually gotten data from revenue and labor before, trying to match up to determine wages and certificates and other things that people are doing. We work with Kansas Board of Regents on some of those things as well. So some of these things are happening. To the degree that they've talked about, they are not, but could be built on top of the system that we already have in place, but that would not be a requirement under this.
Representative Hill might have one comment for, and Dr. Hartwood didn't come to testify on this, so we won't bug him too much, but.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to take it a little bit easy. Easy question. We have how many students in the state of Kansas?
470,000-ish.
Now, a little tougher question. How many data points would we collect on a student by the time he gets through school?
Several thousand per student.
Okay, so we have somewheres, let's just use a nice round term of 40 billion pieces of data every year collected.
And we have 20 years of data.
Yeah. Tell me, Frank, you guys have obviously a data collection department, put a lot of numbers into storage. How many statistical analysis people do you have on staff?
3 or 4.
Okay, and what kind of statistical analysis do they do?
So a variety of things. So one is some of the information we put out about how students that performed on the 10th grade assessment, how they do later on. We look at, whatever questions come up, we work on in that regard. A lot of them is about student success right now and how they move forward with that.
Yeah, so I would encourage, I've seen a lot of reports come out of the department. I have yet to see a confidence interval or a p-value. Now, if you are doing statistical analysis on that, you should have those things. And I would sure like to see them if they're available. Thank you.
And I would say that that's not the information we are asked for. So when you look at, we look at assessment scores and we look at validating the things that we do, those would be available in some of the internal reports. That's usually not the kind of report we get asked for.
Some legislators really like those kind of reports.
All right, being that we kept it on time and we had great decorum and great discussion, I also wanted to give some encouragement and kudos to Chair Estes. There was a great discussion on anti-Semitism, and it was not an easy discussion, but it was well handled and a good one to have in the State House, and I appreciate your leadership on that. It was good to engage in that.
Your words are very kind, and I appreciate it, and it all happened because everybody who participated played along with the rules and had a good discussion in a good spirit in a respectful way. So thank you.
On this bill, I will go ahead and close the hearing, and as far as moving forward, Thursday or Friday with our snow day, you'll get notification on which day we will possibly take action on that. I'm not sure if it will be Thursday or Friday, depending on if we need to have. One update, tomorrow, I think, the State School Board of Education pay equalization will get read in because there was some Thursday. And so Friday, we may put that hearing on so that we can take action on some things and move some of these bills forward, get the consensus of the committee. So on this one, if there are ideas around amendments, I would probably, give you till Friday at the latest. I will probably hold it off until Friday, and we'll do the State Board of Education pay increase. It's not a complex bill. It was kind of something that we voted in the budget in here unanimously. So I don't know that one will take a long time, and it's a one pager. So we'll put that out. We'll get some testimony. We'll move that forward, and then take action Thursday and Friday. Well, just Friday we would take action on possibly this one, and Thursday we have the bill hearing on the foster care transportation enrollment. Take a look at that one, and we will get testimony and everything posted to where you can review that on your snow day and then come in on Thursday. So we will work Thursday and Friday, just because on Monday we've got to have things passed out of this committee. We're not hearing a lot of bills, but now that we're down to the wire, we will do that work Thursday, Friday, and Monday. Okay. Anything else for the good of the committee? All right, with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.